Today we're going to be looking at imperialism in many different ways. Imperialism is an institution under which one nation asserts the right to seize the land or at least to control the government or resources of another people. The thing with imperialism is that there are many different elements to it, and we're going to be looking at the social, economic, and political domination of one nation by another country. Old imperialism, which we've kind of seen a little bit of this in this course, took place during 1500s and the 1800s and included the American colonies. But the new imperialism, which is going to have massive implications worldwide, happened between 1815 and 1914, where the West, meaning Europe and America, will increase its control of the world's land mass from 35% to 85%. That means that by the time we're looking at World War I, and you should assume that imperialism has something to do with World War I, so by the time we are looking, we're going to be going into World War I, Europe, the countries of Europe and America controlled 85% of the land mass in the world. Now, new imperialism, again, between 1850 and 1914, nationalism had produced strong, centrally governed nation states. The Industrial Revolution had made economics stronger as well, and during this time, Japan, the United States, and the industrialized nations of Europe became more aggressive in expanding into other lands. The new imperialism was focused mainly in Asia and Africa, where declining empires and local wars left many states vulnerable. And in Africa, many of their states had been weakened by the legacy of the slave trade. Nationalism played a major part in imperialism. So nationalism is the feelings of intense pride towards your country. When citizens feel so intensely about their country, it is easy to slip beyond patriotism to fanaticism. This leads to feelings that one nation and one way of life is better than any others. Nationalistic thinking makes it easier for imperialists to impose their way of doing things on the colonies that they conquered. Now, there were three types of imperialism based on the country that was taking over the other area. So, and what their needs were. There were colonies, which has direct and complete control. There's a protectorate, which is where control, they control like foreign affairs. The invading country will control foreign affairs, but they're not directly ruled by. So it's this interesting blend of the new conquering country mixed in with the local government. And then there's this idea of a sphere of influence, which is where they're going to control the trade. You kind of want to think of the sphere of influence like a street gang protecting its turf. So let's look specifically at different elements that political, economic, social, and we're throwing in technological ways that imperialism is going to impact the world. So causes of imperialism are primarily economic. Industrialization gives the West the ability to conquer other parts of the world. Large-scale industrial production made Western factories demand more raw materials, which could be seized from less powerful nations. Also, Western nations needed markets for goods produced. The colonies would serve as potential markets, and immense wealth would allow the Western world to conquer distant places. Essentially, the economic need of industrialization will push European and the countries in the United States into the rest of the world in search of raw materials to create their products with and new markets to sell their products to. Another way to look at things is through political power, because in order to go after the economic benefits that colonies offered these empires, they would have to utilize military strategies. And military strategies really fall under that political aspect. So industrialization will bestow new weaponry of all types upon the armies and the navies of the West. Ocean-going fleets, modern rifles, and rapid-fire artillery are extremely important technologies that allow the West to take over and dominate the world. Occasions were rare that native populations could actually resist the Western military forces because they did not have the type of weaponry that the West had invented and began to mass market. The growing need of Western nations to maintain bases and coal/oil stations around the world for naval civilian fleets would actually be part of their empire building. One of the things they were always looking for when building empires is really good ports of call, access to the oceans in order to move those supplies around. Now, ships would require repairs and refueling stations, and these ports would also do that. So governments and countries would strategically place their ports of call. If they were trying to move into China, so to speak, they would first need to determine which ports of call they would need, where they would like them located, and then go after that land in order to push more trade in China or wherever else across the world they were going. Now, all of this conquering or spreading out into the world and colonialism requires some big assists from science and technology, because knowledge was power. Knowledge is power. And so knowing new things and inventing new ways of doing things, better ways of doing things, is going to make your country more successful. Advances in transportation, communication, and warfare brought by the IR enabled Western nations to build empires. IR means the Industrial Revolution. New waves of exploration allowed for better knowledge of the geography of the world. Medical advances helped allow people to go into areas that they could not go into before. As an example, medical advances would make possible for Europeans and Americans to press into tropical regions. The bark of the cinchona tree, native to South America, contains quinine alkaloids used to treat malaria. In the 19th century, cinchona trees began to be widely cultivated in the East Indies and India after many native cinchona trees had been destroyed. So knowing that they couldn't go into parts of Africa due to malaria, now instead they're going to figure out medical ways to get around that hindrance, that problem. A major way that imperialism is going to impact the world at large is through social factors. How did the people live? What were their thoughts? What practices did they push on others? And how do you do that? How do you take over an entire people and assume that your way of doing things is the right way? So Europe's rapid population growth is going to be a primary cause for this need of expansion. It will play a role in prompting imperial activity. Immigration to the Americas was an outlet, so millions of immigrants would come to America. And another outlet was to leave home for colonial life. Ambitious or desperate families would attempt to make their fortunes this way. So you could move into any of these colonies that your country was taking over and hopefully have an opportunity at a better life. A sense of racial superiority was widespread among Westerners. Imperialism created a sense that Western nations were entitled to conquer and colonize areas that appeared backwards or primitive. Now, please note the backwards and primitive are in quotations because many times the conquering people would just call anything they didn't understand or was different as backwards or primitive. Cecile Rhodes, a British imperialist, said, "I contend that we are the finest nation in the world, and the more of it we inhabit, the better." Cecile Rhodes used his great wealth made from mining diamonds in Africa to extend British rule in southern Africa. And upon his death in 1902, much of Rhodes' vast fortune would go to the University of Oxford for the establishment of Rhodes scholarships. But this idea that the British people were the finest race and had the best social expectations and way of living really would help the British and any country who had nationalist feelings. It would really help them be able to go in and take over another country because they felt like they were doing it in order to also not just help the British people, but since they were so great, or in their, since so many British people believed that they had the superior culture, that it was their duty to spread it across the world. Now, another idea that becomes very popular during this time is a scientific idea of Darwinism, or the idea of evolution, but a primary aspect of Darwinism is the idea of natural selection. And natural selection is when it's survival of the fittest. Whoever is the most fit is meant to dominate and survive and spread their lives or their characteristics throughout the population. So social Darwinism would actually come out of this idea. So social Darwinism will encourage imperialism. The idea applied to Darwin's theory of survival of the fittest. Social Darwinists argued that it was natural for stronger nations to dominate weaker nations. This idea was never supported by Darwin, but Charles Darwin was greatly influenced by the geologist Adam Sedgwick and naturalists John Henslow in his development of the theory of natural selection, which was to become the foundation concept supporting the theory of evolution. Darwin's theory holds that environmental effects lead to varying degrees of reproductive success in individuals and groups of organisms. Natural selection tends to promote adaptation in organisms when necessary for survival. This revolutionary theory was published in 1859 in Darwin's now famous treatise on the origin of species by means of natural selection. They would take this scientific concept of evolution and the survival of the fittest and kind of morph it into this social concept of survival of the fittest, so that the strongest nations with the best and strongest way of life would be the controlling or dominant nation. Westerners would believe that it was the white imperialists' duty to teach and modernize the darker-skinned, supposedly primitive peoples of Africa and Asia. And please note, primitive in almost all historical ways just meant misunderstood and a refusal to understand. This idea of being better than the others and better than the countries that they were dominating would ripple through all aspects of life. And Rudyard Kipling wrote a poem called The White Man's Burden. And the poem explained that Westerners were superior to people from the primitive people. And we will be reviewing this poem, or at least a portion of this poem, in a further discussion at the end of this lesson. The British East India Company. Now we're going to shift gears back from the social aspect back to the economic aspects. And one of the ways Britain is going to push into India, the subcontinent of India, and take over that area is by utilizing something called the British East India Company. And it was a company established trade in India, and by the 1800s, by 1800, controlled 3/5 of India. The company would employ Indian soldiers called sepoys, and the sepoys were forced to follow rules against their Muslim religion, and this led to revolt. However, this revolt was crushed by the British Army. The tension that followed caused the British government to take complete control of India in 1858. So from about the 1700s until 1857, the British East India Company is in charge and in control of removing all those natural resources out of India. And they would control the people by utilizing locals and forcing them to do the government's, or excuse me, not the government, but to do the British East India Company's bidding. Eventually, the sepoys will revolt, which requires the British Army to come in and kind of take over. And in 1858, the British government is completely in control of India. Other places that would see major colonial activity, one of those places was China, and the rest of the East. So all of up there, the islands of Asia, like Japan and what becomes Indonesia. But China, remember way back when, China was the place everyone wanted to get because of its materials like tea and porcelain and silk. So China was a primary goal and always had been of Europe. And so they didn't just, and then you want to remember that China had kind of shut its borders down and was refusing to interact with the Western world. So in order to trade for those goods from China, Europe had to find something China wanted. So China and the rest of the East did not want Western culture in their part of the world and greatly resisted imperialism. British merchants began trading opium with China in the 1700s. When the Chinese tried to ban the import of the illegal drug, Britain overpowered them and established colonies in China. And this battle is considered the Opium Wars. After the Opium Wars, other European powers carved up the East with spheres of influence, which meant that foreign countries had exclusive rights within that country. In the late 19th century, Chinese resentment grew toward Japan and Western countries because of their economic and political exploitations and humiliating military defeats of China. Secret Society of Chinese, called the Boxers, began terrorizing Christian missionaries. These attacks would culminated in the violent Boxer uprising in Beijing, which claimed the lives of many of the Chinese and foreigners. After this revolt, or the uprising, Western powers occupied the city and quelled the revolt, and there would be major successions or give-me's that China would end up giving to European powers. Our final slide deals with more political issues. And this actually goes into Africa. Africa, unlike any other of the continents, would be forever altered in massive ways. Not that China or India, and India sees the same kind of extreme colonial impact, but it's very obvious if you look at before imperialism and after imperialism maps, which you're going to do, in order to see the impact that Europe is going to have on the African continent. So this is known as the Scramble for Africa. After 1880, African colonization moved away from gold and slave trade to one of taking over territory. Thanks to better mapped industrial era weapons and medicines, European armies and colonizers were able to penetrate every part of the Dark Continent. This event almost led to war among the nations of Europe several times because all of those different countries in Europe were jockeying for more power in Africa. The Berlin Conference was held, presided over by Bismarck, and it laid down guidelines for African expansion and played a certain role in keeping the peace between European countries. European leaders divided Africa with no regards of who lived there. In 1850, most of Africa was free. By 1914, all of Africa was conquered except Ethiopia and Liberia. The Zulu tribe in Africa, led by Shaku Zulu, tried to resist colonization, but were eventually overpowered. The Boer War, which happened in 1899 and 1902, during this time Africans suffered greatly. Tribe after tribe, country after country would fall to the Europeans. We will be looking a little bit more closely at Africa, Asia, and India, and we'll also be looking at American imperialism with Latin America.